So this is section 8, which is politics in the media, and actually we're going to split this into two parts. And so you'll have slides for Monday, and then I'll also give you a set of slides for Wednesday. So we're doing part 1 actually of section 8 here. So when we discuss the relationship between politics and the media, it's often discussed as a conversation of who controls the other. Does the media impact and control politics, or do politicians manipulate and move the media? And truth be told, it's both. It is a complicated dance, and you'll have people talking surely about fake news and political bias and all that, but just like if we talk about the relationship between media and society and how that's kind of a reciprocal spiral of impact, definitely when we look at politics and the media, the same is true. And a lot of this, of course, depends on what your political stance is at the time and what you see the media doing. We're in a very hyper-partisan moment in our country, and so if you think the media is detracting from your party, then you despise the media and think it's way too political. If you're engaging with a media channel that supports your party or candidate, then you probably think the media is doing a fair job at the moment. So a lot of this depends on your own perspective. If we look at it theoretically, how we're framing this argument between politics and media, there's different ways we can look at it. First route would be through a purely effects model driven theory. And by that, we talked earlier in the semester about the hypodermic needle theory of how messages are driven from point A to point B, and how the media operates much like if we were delivering a shot, an injection. The media is the syringe, right? The message is the thing in that syringe. The doctor, the nurse, whoever puts that message in the syringe, and then you apply it, and then that person walks away with that medicine or with that drug. So the transmission of it is seen more as an effects model process. And if you're looking at it in that way, then what you'll come to realize eventually is that, with that perspective, is that the media does in fact control politics. It controls what's said about elections. It controls political advertising. It sends a message, right? And if you believe just purely in an effects model, then you have to believe that that message is being transmitted, and it is being acted upon once the transmission is complete. There's also another way to look at it, which is this limited effects model. And what we're talking about with limited effects, it applies more than just to politics. We can talk about a limited effects model in several different realms of the media. And a limited effects model is just basically making a statement that sure, the media does have an impact on these issues, but there's other characteristics, there's other things that probably have a much larger impact, right? So if we're talking about a limited effects model in regards to politics in the media, then what we're saying is, well, the media may very well be persuasive and convince people to act one way or the other way. That's certainly a possibility, but there's probably other factors that weigh as much or more so when a person is making some kind of political decision. For example, if you think of your network of friends who surrounds you and their political leanings, much more likely that the influence of your friends' politics play into how you decide things on a political spectrum. Loyalty to party, right? If you have always been categorized and named yourself as a Democrat, then the likelihood that you'll vote Democrat in the next election is pretty high. So party loyalty probably has more of an impact in political decisions and votes than, say, maybe the media. If you look at it, I mean, there's different channels that support different parties in the media, right? And so we've already talked about how people will use media simply to reinforce their own belief system, right? So they'll select media which reinforces their identity. And so, you know, the opinion of your friends, loyalty to party, the affiliation that your parents perhaps had to a party, those things matter and shape who you are. And so the likelihood is that you'll go out and choose media that reinforce that, because it makes you feel more confident about yourself, more sure about your own belief system. It doesn't call your own belief system into question. But these are two ways that we can look at this, and typically that's the two ways that most people look at this in terms of politics and the media. What is the media controlling? How does the media either inform you or manipulate you? What I would like to do is to take a broader look and discuss a concept of political economy, which is to say that if we're talking about media and politics, the discussion needs to be much larger than just saying, is Fox conservative? Is MSNBC liberal? People will claim CNN is liberal, okay? But you have to remember, like we discussed with the last lectures, the media is an industry, and its job is to make money, just pure and outright. So you have some organizations that are more devoted to journalistic ethics and standards than others. But at the end of the day, all of these organizations are certainly trying to turn a buck. And so that process of trying to make money can have its own political effects, right? So when we talk about this concept, this political economy, right, that economics can impact politics, surely, and apply that to the media sphere. Perhaps one of the best people to speak of that was Noam Chomsky. And in fact, he's still speaking of it. He's very he's an elderly man by now. He was probably most well known on television and radio probably in the 60s, in late 60s, early 70s, as a theorist. Interesting thing about him is he's not trained as a political critic. He's a linguist by trade. But he has made many cultural comments and critiques, and almost is known more famously for that than he is his work in linguistics, even though his work in linguistics and the acquisition of language is very well known. But looking at his political debates has kind of made him famous. And so he's making this argument with political economy that the extent of corporate control over communication leaves little possibility of any sustained critique of capitalism or the dominant ideology. In other words, he's saying because we live in a democracy and a capitalistic society, the drive is to keep businesses making money. And in some areas, these corporations are going to have to control the narrative about them in order to do that. In order to sustain capitalism, sustain making a dollar, they're going to have to exercise control over what people know about them. This is at the heart of what Chomsky is saying, is that these media companies and these big corporations, they can work hand in hand to get what they want. And what they want is definitely not to counter the dominant ideology. They want to keep the status quo going. They want to continue to make money in the ways they've made money, right? And so Chomsky boils things down into what he calls 5 filters. These are just basically 5 different concepts, different practices that he sees that media and big corporations, primarily big corporations, 5 practices that they do to control content and to make sure that the content that is put out in front of you supports the dominant ideology as opposed to countering the dominant ideology. So if we look at these filters, the first one being ownership and profit orientation. So what do I mean by that? I mean that these companies are going to lobby behind and support government regulations that help them maintain profits, help them operate and work in a capitalist society. So we'll talk a little bit later about net neutrality, but net neutrality is kind of exactly a shining, example of what we're doing here in looking at ownership and profit orientation. Big companies like Verizon or AT&T or Sprint, they certainly want to get rid of the concept of net neutrality. In other words, what I'm saying is, and without an understanding of net neutrality, I get that you're kind of in the dark. Let's put it this way. Verizon, Sprint, AT&T, they don't want you to have an unlimited plan, right? Because they want to be able to make money off of selling you access to the internet. They would love to have a tiered system. Now, you may notice that in cell phone companies right now, we're going back to an unlimited plan. That's because the consumers are demanding that. It's because consumers are not comfortable with this strict data usage. And also consumers are afraid that the next shoe to drop will be data restrictions on home internet use, not just cell phones. So consumers are fighting against that. But what net neutrality also does is if you break down net neutrality, it would allow, or you counter net neutrality is what I'm trying to say, it would allow these telecom companies to charge for speeds, right? They already will tell you they charge for speeds now, right? You pay one amount for DSL, you pay one amount for fiber, whatever. But what they're talking about is not necessarily a technology speed. What they're talking about is the speed by which information is given to you. To give you an example, if Metrocast is trying to get you to buy the latest Star Wars film on pay-per-view, Metrocast is charging $3.99 for you to watch that movie. And you get to watch it for 2 days and then you're done. Metrocast is also giving you internet access. You get both your cable and your internet access. Netflix just signed a deal not too long ago with Star Wars, with Lucasfilm, Disney. They're all the same thing now. Netflix signed a deal with Disney so that as soon as, or not long after, the Star Wars films are released on home DVD and home download, not too much later after that, they go straight to Netflix. Netflix gets priority on those films. So Metrocast is selling you the pay-per-view of the Star Wars movie, or if you wait 2 weeks later, a month later, you could see it on Netflix. Metrocast is selling you internet access by which you can get Netflix. So what you're seeing now is that there's a conflict here that's going on. You can spend $10 a month on Netflix and watch all the movies that are on that platform, and you can watch them over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And you pay $10 a month for that, or you pay Metrocast $3.99 to watch one movie, and you can watch it for 2 days max. Metrocast is at that point losing money on their pay-per-view. They want to make sure that people aren't running towards Netflix to see that movie that they're trying to sell themselves. So what do? They do what's called throttling. They throttle down the speed by which Netflix can run. And these companies have time and time again told Congress that they don't use this tactic. However, there's clear evidence by many people in the tech industry that shows throttling does indeed occur. In fact, there's charts that show you that speeds are reduced, and then as soon as a contract negotiation is signed, all of a sudden the data transmission speed magically goes up. There's nothing magic about it. Whatever internet service there or cable service, they're throttling, right? So what net neutrality was always intended to do was to say, we want to kill that tier system. All traffic should flow at the same rate of speed through whatever means you have. So if you have a fiber network, then great, you're going to get things moving at fiber speed. And your fiber provider, whether it be Metrocast or AT&T, they should not have things built into the technology to slow certain companies getting to you. If they're allowed to do that, to slow things down, then guess what's going to happen? Because someone's going to complain, Metrocast can't tell us that we can't get Netflix, and they can't discriminate against Netflix. And what Metrocast will do is say, okay, so if you pay us an extra $10 a month, we won't throttle Netflix. In order to do that, you have to disband net neutrality. So what are these companies going to do? Companies like the big cable companies. Of course, they're going to try to go against net neutrality. They want the ability to make a tiered system, make as much money as possible. So what are they going to do? Well, this whole net neutrality issue is going to be decided by the FCC and by Congress. So these companies will put lots of money into lobbying policymakers, congressmen, congresswomen. They'll put lots of money behind making sure that net neutrality gets struck down. And indeed, we've seen that coming. And is really likely more so in the near future to be more of an issue. By the way, the second largest lobbying sector in America is the media. First is defense spending. Companies that make things for the Department of Defense. The second is the media. The media spends a ridiculous amount of money on lobbying efforts. the second filter that Chomsky talks about is the ability to attract and retain advertisers. Advertisers have an interest in maintaining dominant ideology as well, right? They don't want their product to be on a show that has controversy. Therefore, if your show has done something controversial, has done something that is against the dominant ideology, you're going to lose your advertisers. Advertisers are what pay for your show and keep you going. When your ratings get better, your ad rates go up, you make more money. The whole thing works because advertisers are there in the middle. So if you do something, say something, behave in some way, support a platform that appears controversial and against the dominant ideology, advertisers might flee, right? So I'll just give you an example of how that can come into play. And so what this was, or what you're seeing right here, is when Laura Ingraham made a comment about David Hogg, who was one of the students involved in the Parkland shooting. And he posted something because he didn't get accepted to one of the colleges he wanted
reports of
to go
harassment.
to.
Some big name advertisers
And
now pulling out of Bill O'Reilly's
she said
show.
some mean things to him. Well, advertisers threatened to pull out of the show, and in fact, that was in reaction to David Hogg.
To pursue truth, which at times
let
can
me
be
pause
very
this so I can
difficult.
explain it. That was in reaction to David Hogg basically tweeting back to her and saying, okay, and not just to her, but to everyone that follows her or people that were looking for her on Twitter. He tweets with her name, and hashtag, okay, here's who advertises on Laura Ingraham. If you don't support what she said about me, then boycott these advertisers. So what happens? The thing goes viral. The advertisers that were with her go, oh my God, we have a liability here. You know, we're going to, if people do decide to stop buying our products because of what Laura Ingraham said, that would be bad. So they just pull their advertising from Laura Ingram's show and say, well, we don't support what she said, and therefore we're no longer going to advertise on her show. So, of course, Laura Ingraham half-heartedly issued an apology and did her best to try to gain back those advertisers. So in this way, just the threat of advertisers leaving has an impact on what you say in the media.
It's like threading a needle. It's a razor's edge. If, in this case, let's say, the allegations
and all this
turned
is
out to be
showing
not
in
true,
the rest of this
where would
video
Judge
is that
Moore go to get his
this
good
is also
name
a tactic that
This
was used
is the
against,
last episode of the Glenn Beck program.
Glenn Beck
and we
here, used against Sean Hannity.
We've
used
really
against
done some
Bill
amazing
O'Reilly,
things together.
Rush Limbaugh has also
You, wherever you are,
haven't had an
and all of us
advertiser
here.
boycott.
And it has been an amazing journey.
So, just kind of an example there of how that importance of advertisers and making sure you don't do anything to upset the advertisers, that impacts what you say and how you say it in the media. Influence from outside wealthy, powerful groups, that can impact what is said. One of the things I didn't want to make this all a total kind of negative reaction against Trump and the GOP. A lot of these examples actually are more easily shown on YouTube in regards to criticizing Trump and the GOP. Trump was famous for threatening both the New York Times, Washington Post, and CNN, and saying that he wanted to have their press credentials pulled. In other words, they wouldn't be able to ask him questions, ask his press secretary questions. They would not be invited into the press room at the White House. That's what I mean here by influence from outside wealthy, powerful groups. If you want to get a story on a topic, but the people that are in charge of that story basically refuse to give you access, then you have no story. So this is why Washington Post, New York Times were upset, because if they couldn't be in the press room to ask questions, then basically their reporting of the presidency will be through a third outside source, not from themselves, which looks bad. So they want to maintain access to these people, which means you don't want to tick them off too much, right? So whether it be an interest group, a political party, some industry sector, corporations, whatever, they can provide access to media. And so companies, or media companies rather, will try not to upset that group. And I said I wouldn't try to focus on Trump, but I am. Some of the most famous thing is, or one of the most famous things in regards to that is Trump actually refusing to go on a debate hosted by Fox, because at that time Megyn Kelly was an anchor and host of the debates, and he did not like her line of questioning. So in one debate where all of the GOP nominees, or candidates rather, seeking the nomination, all those candidates were debating. You remember when you had 8 people on stage all trying to talk at once. Trump actually didn't attend one of those as a form of protest against Megyn Kelly and Fox, and he was famous for kind of saying that, oh, your ratings are going to drop. It's going to be the worst debate in terms of viewership, and indeed the numbers did drop. So it's just it's this belief that you don't want to run content that's not favorable to a group, especially if you're trying to get access to that group later for a story. And I can actually show you I thought I had this video. Hold on one second. Here's another example, and it's not actually using Trump. This is an example of Israel deciding to revoke press credentials for Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is a news operation that was based out of the Middle East. The perception is that Al Jazeera was friendly to terrorist organizations. That has yet to really be proven as true, but what is known is that their journalism does appear to be solid and has won several awards globally and within the United States. They've broken a lot of big stories, and there's a lot of old school journalists that really respect Al Jazeera. The fact that it's owned by a company that's headquartered in the Middle East doesn't concern them as much, because they believe the reporting's solid. But Israel, in the tense relationship that it has with the rest of the Middle East, it didn't want to gamble on Al Jazeera being biased in any way. So what happens is Al Jazeera has its press credentials revoked, and so it no longer has access, right? Israel views Al Jazeera as a terrorist supporting network. It pulls press credentials. Al Jazeera can't report. And that's the breakdown of this.
Israel is planning to shut down Al Jazeera operations. The country has plans to revoke the media credentials of the Qatar-based station's TV journalists, close its Jerusalem bureau, and the station's broadcasts from local cable and satellite providers. Last month, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accused Al Jazeera of inciting violence in Jerusalem. An official close to the prime minister said, quote, "There is no shortage of free speech in this country. There are plenty of dissenting voices. In democratic countries, there are also things that are unacceptable, and a lot of what Al Jazeera is saying and broadcasting falls into that category.
All right, so if we look at the other filters, wrapping up here with these two last filters, FLAC is a term that's used. What does FLAC mean? FLAC just means that if, as a media company, you run a story that's not favorable to someone, and the way Chomsky is talking is he's basically saying if a media company runs content unfavorable to the dominant ideology or to capitalism as a whole or certain politicians, if your media company runs something negative, there's always this threat that there'll be blowback, there'll be legal consequences, right? And so this can not only come from politicians, and I have a quick clip here of Trump basically claiming that he's going to have a lawsuit against the New York Times. So let me play that.
No paper is more corrupt than the failing New York Times. The good news, it is failing. It won't be around too much longer, but they are really, really bad people.
Donald Trump tearing into the New York Times for its reporting on women accusing Trump of touching them inappropriately. Trump's team called the article reckless and defamatory and demanded a retraction and an apology. Failure to comply, Trump's lawyer warned, would leave Trump no choice but to pursue all available actions and remedies. The candidate has made it sound like a lawsuit is imminent.
It will be part of the lawsuit we are preparing against them.
So there's an example of the Times wanting to run articles or having articles that it's run not favorable to the candidate, and the candidate's response is, "I'll sue you. You better stop or I'll sue you." Another example that I don't have here to show you a clip from, but if you ever get a chance to watch the movie The Insider, it's a very good example of all of this. It basically tells the story, and it has a Mississippi tie-in to it. There's a part of it that's taking place in Mississippi. But the movie is about a tobacco industry executive who is fired from his job. One of the reasons why he was fired from his job is because he was one of the head chemists. And he was reluctant and hesitant to start adding a chemical into the cigarette that would make the effects of the nicotine go to your brain faster, but there was some evidence to show that it was cancer causing. And so he was hesitant to start applying that chemical to the product. He was fired, was let go, and long story short, he decides that he's going to talk to a reporter to tell them that Big Tobacco, and this goes back to the late 80s, early 90s, that Big Tobacco was indeed aware of the fact that cigarettes were addictive, nicotine was addictive, definitely caused cancer, that the companies knew that. For the longest time, when tobacco was called to testify before Congress, it would hem and haw and say, well, we don't think nicotine is addictive. We have nothing to show that it's addictive, and we really don't have any, concrete proof that everyone that smokes a cigarette is going to die of cancer. Right? There's some people that get cancer, there's some people who don't. So it's questionable whether our product really does that or not. So this chemist, he had information, and he spills his guts, so to speak, to 60 Minutes. It's a true story. 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes does the interview, is preparing to release the interview. They run ads for it, they promote it, then all of a sudden the clip doesn't show up, and people start to wonder why. And it turns out that the tobacco company was threatening to sue 60 Minutes and CBS. At the time that was going on, CBS was looking to do a deal with Westinghouse. Westinghouse was going to buy out CBS. The top executives at CBS would make tons of money in their stock options from that buyout. And so the executives did not want to have this pending lawsuit over their head. So they chose not to run the piece. And it pretty much destroyed this chemist's life because Big Tobacco was threatening him physically. They would send, there were letters that would show up in his mailbox. There were bullets that often showed up in his mailbox to just remind him that people were watching. And so the threat of a lawsuit by Big Tobacco against CBS made them scared enough to not run the piece. Later on, it's the actual journalists at 60 Minutes that decide that CBS should not be bullied like this, and the journalists basically, and the head journalist really, that was Mike Wallace at the time. Mike Wallace basically said, look, this is what we do. We're not going to hold off on this story, and if you hold off on this story, I will tell the press why. And so CBS finally caved in on that. So the fifth filter that we're talking about, this last piece here, is the fear of being labeled anti-American. It is this fear that if you say anything to be contrary to the dominant ideology, to be contrary to capitalism, if you say those things, the fear is that you will be labeled anti-American, right? So if you want to criticize the current ruling party, that's fine. If you get labeled anti-American, that's a backlash to it. And no one wants to be labeled anti-American or unpatriotic. And so we see this method employed a lot. I'll show you here this clip in which John Brennan, who is past head of the military, I believe, or head of defense or whatever, is being critical of Trump now. And saying things, Brennan saying things against Trump's presidency, and saying that basically he's making unwise decisions and he shouldn't be trusted with control of the military. As a response to Brennan saying these things, the media comes out. They don't like how Trump is being criticized. And especially, I mean, we all know that Fox is more likely to support Trump on issues. And so this new show basically, or this segment basically, is made to paint Brennan and his critique as unpatriotic and un-American.
I think Mr. Trump has demonstrated a paranoia and insecurity, as well as a real concern about the investigation that is underway.
CIA Director John Brennan holding himself up as a paragon of virtue and vowing to keep up his harsh criticism of President Trump, saying he'll speak out until integrity returns to the White House.
Here to react, former Deputy Assistant to the President and Fox News National Security Analyst Dr. Sebastian Gorka. Doctor, always good to have you here. Sounds like Dr. Brennan is going to be speaking out for a long time.
Well, until he's probably charged with being at the center of Spygate. And this is a man who has done something no other former CIA director has ever done. Nobody has attacked a sitting president the way John Brennan does, in a way that undermines the integrity of the current government. He's actually feeding in to Russian propaganda and supporting people like Vladimir Putin with what he states, which shouldn't surprise anybody because John Brennan has actually admitted and this is the shocking thing, that at the height of the Cold War in 1976, he voted for Gus Hall, the Communist Party candidate for American president. That's when the Soviet Union was trying to destroy America. This man has a track record which clearly is unpatriotic and un-American.
Doctor, maybe I'm naive, but I thought CIA directors of either party, you know, whether it was somebody nominated by President Bush or somebody nominated by President Carter, that they were supposed to be nonpartisan.
Well, it's funny you should say that, Ed. On his Twitter feed, it actually says under his bio, non-partisan or neutral individual. This guy is a political hack, and as the good bard Shakespeare said, the lady doth protest too much. He is making so much noise because he knows that he is at the center of Spygate. Remember that Australian ambassador? You remember how it all began, how they sent operatives overseas to talk to him? That only happens with John Brennan's approval. So the whole dossier leads back to John Brennan, and that's why he's being so loud now.
So when you say doth protest too much, you think that John Brennan has become sort of unhinged because he's worried this investigation is turning on him?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We now know that this was an interagency operation. It included the CIA, the FBI, DNI. Clapper is trying to cover, but he's perjuring himself as well. But at the center of all of this is John Brennan, and that's why he's being so loud now. And John Brennan doesn't launch a political attack using the intelligence community against Donald Trump without President Obama's approval. So this is why the man is unhinged.
Well, quickly, what about the morale and the decency of the agency that he ran? I mean,
so there we have an example of Gorka here, basically taking someone who has critiqued the president and been very critical of the president's policies, and in response, the argument is, well, he's doing this because he's anti-American, he's un-American, he's not patriotic. He should not be trusted. He's unhinged. He's not thinking clearly. So you're discrediting a critique of the dominant ideology at the time. So those are the 5 filters that Chomsky speaks of. We're going to end it right there. When we pick back up with the next lecture, we will talk about media and politics in terms of another theory, which is agenda setting theory, and how all that works. I also have more to give you regarding the mechanics of net neutrality and what's going on with that issue. So I will see you next time.